city of Jacksonville, Florida. The very entrance into this continent. Not only of darkness, but we're turning it around to bring light to the whole continent. So I rejoice to be with you tonight. I rejoice at what God is doing. Not only here, but the whole continent. So, I'm from the Blackfoot people of Alberta, Canada, and into northern Montana. I come from the Native Americans that have existed here in this continent for hundreds and hundreds of years. And there's some rich tradition among the Native Americans of this continent. And many of you don't know it, but among our our stories and our folklore and some of the things that was passed on down by oral tradition, but they spoke of a greater day that was coming, not only to Native Americans but to this continent. From just hearing it from my own mother when we were young, talking about how the gospel was going to be brought into this continent. And it was going to come to the Native Americans, but it was going to be through some unique ways it was going to be brought. I remember in my background, in the tradition I'm from, we have this mythical character named Napi. But today it's been bastardized, using the words of Bishop Curry. I'm purposely not looking at him. You know, they've almost made him a god, and there's a lot of spirituality behind it. But growing up in the stories that were handed down from my parents, first of all, and grandparents, they talked about Napi. He was a way to describe creation. The stories to describe creation. But my mother talked about one story in particular, about how the day would come that this, called the Black Book, would come to these shores. One day Napi was sitting on a mountain because he was a trickster. He did all kinds of tricks, and so it was kind of hilarious for us kids to hear about it. But she said one day Napi sat on this mountain and looked eastward to the great waters, which we now know is the Atlantic Ocean. And on those waters were men coming. They were black-robed, and they were carrying a black book. Napi knew that his days of fables and of just stories was coming to a close, because he saw when that book was coming to the shores of this continent, he disappeared into the bowels of the earth. And my mother would say, the day was coming, like the words of the psalmist said, "Behold, I come in the volume of the book. It is written of me." And so to the Native Americans, it was always in our stories. They talked about the day when the Creator had a son whose name was Jesus, the Redeemer, was coming to these shores. In that day, we would not have to rely on folklore, but we would have reality amongst us. But you know, the enemy came in through many of the genocide activity towards the Native Americans on this continent. But I believe God's going to overturn that. I believe we have a king of justice that sits at the right hand of God in heaven. And I believe that this king of justice is going to overturn what the enemy tried to do in genocides. Because I have gone from the shore, I've gone up and down Canada and into parts of the United States, and I have seen the miraculous. I've seen the power of God evident in Native American nation communities. I've seen miracle after miracle. Just this last July, I was in northern Quebec, and we saw the power of God fall. I mean, I couldn't even lay hands on the people. God was instantly healing and delivering and set free. I saw the demon-possessed crawling on the ground, but in moments of time, by the word of the Lord, they were being set free. I saw the power of God, and I was amazed. I just stood back, and I saw the glory of God come. And then your bishop begins to talk about angelic presence in meetings, we began to see those things begin to operate even in our own prayer meetings back home. I just mentioned in particular one incident, and I'm not going to preach about that tonight, where Paul talks about women having a covering, and we just kind of mentioned it in passing in a prayer meeting, and my sister said, "I'm going to obey that." And she put a covering on her head, and that night the power of God came, and our meeting went from here to here. The glory of God, we sensed an angelic presence. I believe there's angels that are walking up and down, ready to obey the will of God. And so this place is not going to be the same. The gospel of the kingdom has come to these shores, and it's going to light the way for the whole continent. Praise the Lord.